So welcome everyone. I'm going to talk a lot about Scorpio, obviously, for this forecast because it's all about Scorpio. But problem with Scorpio is that it can so easily go south, and that is literally the direction of Mars, south. So when you hear the phrase something goes south, that's the direction of Mars. So it's like, and your Lord Yama. So the fact that we're having Mars now moving into Scorpio on the day of the eclipse, and then we'll conjunct Ketu, which we'll talk about, and then we'll conjunct the eclipse degree by the end of the month, means that we've got one thing after the other in this month. And I have predicted this already a year ago, I think, or more. I don't know. I can't remember exactly when, but I said that this would be another wave of the virus. But I also said that this was part of getting out of the pandemic. And I think that this is actually bearing fruit, because I even just today saw a BBC interview of one of the doctors who apparently was the first to confirm one of the cases for this new variant in South Africa. By the way, South Africa, south. And when I show you the eclipse, the eclipse is going over South Africa. So anyway, and the doctor was saying basically, now remember where we are in the world with this, and think about the sign Scorpio and what it does and how it can catastrophize. And it does so for a very good reason, because it wants to prepare us for the worst. But of course, as we know, the worst usually almost never happens, right? So if it never happens, but we're like preparing ourselves for the worst, you have to think about, when you throw in an eclipse to Scorpio, how we can get really distorted. And we can really go to our worst case scenario and then distort that worst case scenario. And then we're all of a sudden locking down countries again over what it seems to be now, a variant that's actually very mild, according to this doctor in South Africa, who's saying that the patients she has been seeing are presenting with very mild cases, not even sore throat, like aches and pains. And so anyway, I don't want to get into the whole kind of controversy around the eclipse or the virus and all of that, but it's quite clear that a Scorpio eclipse with Mars and Ketu is showing this overreactive, not thinking, kind of gut instinct to kind of lock down and to fear monger and all of that, where it might not be necessary. Because actually, like I said, what I think this is going to lead to is the end of the pandemic. And I know that's a big claim, but let's face it, this has happened historically over and over again. When we've had pandemics, when humanity's had pandemics in the past, they have had variant after variant, which basically got milder and milder and then became endemic. So just look back in history, just study history, and you'll see this has been the case. So it's nothing new, I'm saying. But of course, I can only say it as an astrologer, and this is what the astrology is also saying, that this Mars going into Scorpio conjunct Ketu and the eclipse, yes, it's another wave, but and more variants, but it's going to move this along much quicker. That's what Mars does in a great strength in its own sign, Scorpio. So it does bring it out. It's almost like a healing crisis, and it increases the cases. And yes, of course, people will suffer from it and people will die from it, as it's an ongoing pandemic, but it will, like I said, move the story forward. And I said the eclipse in December last year and the eclipse in December this year were like the two wheels of how we're going to move out of this, basically. And I'm sticking with that. I do believe that's the case. So anyway, so that's something to think about in terms of this pandemic. But before we get into that, we might forget that Neptune is hanging out there in space, kind of distorting things. I hope you can see the screen okay. But you might not notice this shift because it's a very slow shift, but it is stationing direct on December 1st. So starting the month off, we have this Neptune moving around. And this is important because it actually heralds its exit from Aquarius next year, and then finally in 2023, because it will return into Aquarius in September 2022. but then finally then in 23 move on. So it's at least showing that we are moving this story forward. And Neptune is obviously, well, not obviously, you might not know this, but it's going to conjunct Jupiter in April next year. And when you have that combination, it can really lead to a lot of different significations. So I'll maybe highlight a few, positive and negative. Positive would be more hope, more sense of things moving on in April next year for sure. Negative would be flooding and major catastrophe, you know, really major flooding next year. That's what I envision. To the point where it could cause so much damage in certain, whatever part is hit in the world, that they have to spend a long time rebuilding, years rebuilding. That kind of flooding. And I'm not saying that lightly. I'm looking at these conjunctions and historic conjunctions of these planets, and then looking at Saturn conjunct Neptune in the years to follow. It does indicate that there's going to be this massive flooding and then having to restructure. And of course, you just have to apply that to everything in society when you think about all of our problems and all of that. So flooding in other ways could be this kind of need to kind of move on in one way, this kind of mass movement, in other words, and this eventual then kind of rebuilding society in a way when we're looking at Saturn, then move into Aquarius and then into Pisces conjunct Neptune. So Jupiter moves in first and creates this ideal, and then Saturn moves in after and does the building of that ideal. So we are going through some massive changes in society in the next few years. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you don't need astrology to tell you that. But like I said, this Neptune station now direct at the end of Aquarius moving into Pisces next year is a hint, a very subtle hint, but a hint nonetheless at what may come. So anyway, let's back to December, because this is really where it's at in this eclipse. So you can always go to, if you want to, you know, check out eclipses anytime, you go to timeanddate.com. It's the best website for looking at eclipses. They have all of the details you would ever need for astronomically anyway for the eclipse, and then some. They have a lot. So this is the eclipse. Now you can see here that it's you'd have to go to the Antarctic to see the full eclipse, but I'll play that again because you can see that it is a partial eclipse over South Africa. So it is partial over South Africa. They are seeing a partial eclipse over South Africa. So it's no wonder that we're seeing this variant come out of South Africa, in other words. So this is the best advice for Scorpio, always. Always, always, always the best advice. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. Plan for the worst is Scorpio, hope for the best is Sagittarius. And that always moves the story along. So we are going to be going through this kind of dynamic for the next few weeks because of the transits. But remember, Mars is really strong in Scorpio. So the power and strength and courage and determination is there. So that's the key thing. So this is the new moon on the 4th. This is the eclipse, a total solar eclipse. Like I said, really down south. Again, think of south and the Mars direction in the Antarctic, South Africa. And this is where it's happening in the lunar mansion Jeshta, the elder. Now, what's interesting about this as well is that, you know, the symbol of the umbrella and the Lord Indra that rules this sign, the god of the rains, is interesting as well. But it really ties into, in terms of the symbol here, in terms, it's all about protection, basically. So knowledge is power. This is associated with Mercury in the planetary cycles. And it's at the very end of Scorpio. And of course, then it's associated with Mars and Ketu. So that kind of combination is quite interesting because we have all of these planets here anyway, right now. Mars, Ketu, Mercury, and the sun and moon, all coming together in Scorpio for this new moon and solar eclipse. So it's intense. And again, I'm using that word freely now. I can free reign to use the word intense today. But again, it could be intensely good. And like I said, this sign is all about secrets. It's all about secret knowledge. Knowledge is power. And the more power, the more knowledge you get, the more power you get. So protect yourself with knowledge is what I'm trying to say. And you can read into that whatever you want. So this is a new moon. It's a powerful new moon. It's like a supercharged new moon when it's an eclipse. It's though also a debilitated moon. And so I've told you all of the great things about this eclipse. Now maybe look at the not so great things. And that is, there could be a high potential here for the mind, a very distorted mind, an eclipsed sun. So that's the moon casting its shadow over the sun, a debilitated moon that is eclipsing the sun. So a debilitated mind, a distorted, gloomy looking mind, distorting the truth of the sun. That's high potential for this eclipse. So by next weekend, just check that. I would say, check your mind. Are you catastrophizing? Are you thinking the worst? But actually, are you really completely distorting reality for this eclipse next weekend? It happens on Saturday, the 4th of December. This is a nice quote, I think, from we could apply for it, the Tao Te Ching, and it's, nothing is weaker than water, but when it attacks something hard or resistant, then nothing withstands it, and nothing will alter its way. So there's a sort of inevitability of Scorpio in one way. I mean, we have to pay our taxes, we have to die. So that's Scorpio, right? But at the same time, there's a strength in Scorpio that's not obvious. It's not always obvious externally. Like the most famous person I can think of as Scorpio is Bruce Lee, who would have taken a lot of his philosophy from these kinds of philosophical writings. And he would say something like, be like water. He's like, I was reading something about him once where he was like, he was really frustrated with his teacher or something, or the teaching he was being given, and he wasn't getting it. And he went out on a boat, and then in anger, he started hitting the water. But he was realizing that as he was hitting the water, that the water was like, it was weak on the one hand, but it was like, it wasn't taking any of his force. Like, like a martial artist would crack something or break some wood or whatever it is. So there's this kind of, this resilience to water, this kind of pliability, but there's also the strength, because nothing can stand in its way, So that's the sign Scorpio. This is the chart for the new moon and eclipse on the 4th of December. You can see here, the moon and sun are at 18 degrees with Scorpio. Ketu is at 6 degrees. Mercury is quite close to this eclipse at 21 degrees. And it is, like I said, associated with this lunar mansion, Jeshta, at the end of Scorpio anyway. And, we've had an intense time. 2 weeks prior, there was the full moon and an almost completely eclipsed moon with Rahu in Taurus. It was extreme, it was heightened. And when you start with a full moon, obviously then it wanes into the new moon. So it like decreases in intensity. Whereas normally if you have the new moon first, the solar eclipse first, then it increases in intensity up to the lunar eclipse, but this one's the other way around. So it started really intense, and then it starts to wane into the new moon. And then there's a whole reset basically that's happening for this new moon in Scorpio. And so that's very positive in many ways. And again, the strength of Mars coming in here after, yes, it's going to show potential, massive upheavals and all of that, and destruction, and who knows what kind of attacks going on, and another wave of the virus and all of that. But ultimately there's a strength there, and it's not always an obvious strength. And this is the problem, really, I guess, because it's Mars-Ketu. So again, Mars moves in on the eclipse day on the 4th. At the very end of the day here, Mars is moving in 4th, 5th, but then it conjuncts Ketu on the 14th, 15th. That's a real red flag. And I'm using that term very purposely for Mars-Ketu, because Ketu literally means flag. That's one translation of the word. And Mars likes to put a flag up as well and, declare victory. But both of these are really strong. And so this has the potential to be either very destructive and completely irrational and impulsive and reactive, or very purposeful and directed and laser beam like focus on something to get rid of something that you want to get rid of in your life. It could go either way. And of course, I'm sure you know which one you'd prefer to be on. And you can channel it. You can be aware of it, especially again by mid-month, 14th, 15th in particular, they come exactly together. So we're likely to see some massive kind of something in the world, some explosive events, some outages, some blackouts, some attacks. The fact that it's a solar eclipse, and then by the end of December 30th and 31st, Mars conjoins the eclipse degree. You're talking about the sun being affected here, and the sun is afraid of Ketu. It loses its power. It doesn't shine so bright. It's like being sucked into a black hole. It's literally like our sun being sucked into a black hole. So there's all of these issues around resources, all of these issues around leadership and leaders in particular, and that could be a theme around the world as well. We might see some of that play out. So it doesn't have to happen on the 4th of December. It could be on the 30th or 31st that it happens, or it could be leading up to that point, or again, mid-month, 14th, 15th, where these two come together. So try and be mindful of not overreacting, I would say, to your own gloomy predictions or to anyone else's, is what I would say. And try and use the strength of these two planets, because they're at home in their own sign, Scorpio, very strong, to overcome your fears. The pitfall is thinking about the worst case scenario in order to prepare your mind for the worst is admirable on the one hand, and yet so that you're prepared. Because if you never thought of, you know, what might go wrong in your life ever, if you never thought about, oh, and you never heard of this thing called death, what's that then? Or taxes, what I have to pay what now? Or that we die. If you've never heard of those things and they happened, or they happened to you or to someone close to you, that's quite shocking. That is really hard to get over then, because that's also what Ketu can do, is create shock and awe. And it's kind of like that kind of experience when there's a massive explosion, or there's a lot of people are killed in one incident. It's this kind of shock and awe that it creates, this kind of silence, this stillness in the background of everything. And we realize, actually, wait, our life here is fleeting. And then actually we're all part of something greater, and we're all connected. And as soon as we see people get killed, we sense that straight away. So it's all admirable to be doing that, to be thinking about the worst case scenario, to prepare your mind. But as long as you drop it as soon as you've done that. And the pitfall of Scorpio, as it's a fixed sign, is that it keeps it up over and over again. And it gets into this mental loop of the worst case scenarios all the time, and thinking the worst all the time, and never subjecting the mind to anything else. You know, so again, that's why it's important to, yes, prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. Take it from Scorpio into Sagittarius and uplift the mind. So that's Scorpio in a nutshell, I think. The next complication here, though, of course, is that we have this beginning now, as soon as Mars moves into Scorpio, this Kalasarpa Yoga. So it's not strictly a Kalasarpa Yoga in a sense, when planets haven't moved over to the other side of the nodes, and certainly haven't moved out of the signs themselves, but it's a type of, or it's a flavor of, or it's a shade of this kind of combination. So we could say that this shade is happening from the 4th until the 24th of April next year, when Mercury moves out of Aries into Taurus, because Mercury will be the first planet to break this in April. So we're having a shade of this for the next few months, in other words, and it does create, you know, as this image suggests, a bit of ups and downs. There's a kind of lopsidedness that we have. We have this sense of uncertainty, of change. But I would say, again, in a more positive sense, in the context of this current climate and what we're living through, change is a good thing, right? But it is going to create a lot of upheaval on the planet for the next few months, as it has in the last 2 years. It happens quite often when Jupiter and Saturn come together, because then all the planets at some point move over on one side. So it's not unusual at this time. It's kind of like an ongoing theme, and it most definitely connects in with that tarot card, the Wheel of Fortune, where it feels like, you know, you're getting somewhere, and then it's like there's a swinging around again, and then we're getting somewhere, and then it's a swinging around again. And you know, that's the kind of sense as well, if you've ever had or known anyone who's had a virus, for example, you know, that's chronic. You know that there's this kind of healing crisis that happens, and then they get better, and then it gets worse, and then it gets better, and it gets, so this is kind of like what we're living through in a very real way with the virus, because Ketu literally rules viruses. But in another way, it's more like a virus of the mind, basically, what we're seeing with this Kalasarpa yoga. And the nodes more than not represent problems of the mind, because they're not physical entities. They're shadows that are cast over the sun or moon. So we've had the moon overshadowed very recently, and now we're going to have the sun overshadowed, and it creates this distortion in the mind. So it also reflects our, again, impulsive, reactive, knee-jerk reaction to things when we're in that fear-based state, where we don't maybe make the best decision. So again, as long as you check yourself that you're not, that you are calm and that you're centered. And one of the best things for Ketu is to literally be centered. It rules the center. Ketu rules the center of everything. Like even literally in a country, it rules the center, like the capital city of a country. It's like the central hub. But in terms of our own being, Ketu is our center. And there's that stillness at the center of a storm, that if we can tap into that, then the decisions we make are right on point. Now that's really important, especially throughout December, because of Mars and Ketu coming together by mid-month, especially mid-month, because this overreactive kind of quality is there. So as long as we're not being that way, we can really center ourselves, and then the next action that is required is quite obvious to us. So this is as an example chart, because it's easier just to relate this to a person than it is to world events, which are, we could say, kind of general in a way. But in terms of a person, Ghislaine Maxwell is a good example. And I want to use this as an example for you to see actually that really, it's not everybody who's going to experience this eclipse intensely. You have to have planets near, or sensitive degrees near the eclipse. You'd also have to be in a cycle that's triggering the eclipse, like Rahu Ketu or Mars in this case. So this is the case for Ghislaine Maxwell. She has her rising degree very close opposite in Taurus at 16 degrees, nearly 17 degrees. This eclipse is at 18 degrees. So you can see that it is triggering her in a big way. So the eclipse is at 18 degrees of Scorpio, opposite her ascendant degree. And of course, the trial starts tomorrow. And it's going to take about 6 weeks for the trial to last. So it's perfect timing in terms of the eclipse, of course, because what does the eclipse in your 7th house, Scorpio in the 7th house with Mars in the 7th house do? It dredges things up from the past. It literally pushes things out into our awareness, because Mars likes to externalize things. Ketu keeps them secret, perhaps. So she's been going through all of this on her own, but now it's going to be pushed out into the open. Now that is also the case for many other things in the world in the next few weeks. But again, I'm just using her as an example to show how this is going to impact her. Now, remember, she's in a Mars cycle, and it's Mars-Venus, by the way. And so there's a mixed bag here, because Mars rules the 7th and 12th in the 8th, and Venus rules the 1st and 6th in the 8th. So this is kind of, there are these what are called reversal yogas going on, where she has bad houses going to another bad house. So it's like a double negative. So I don't know if that means she's going to get off a bit lighter than people suggest. She's going to be charged. I don't know what's going to go on, but it seems like there's some getting away with something at least. But I don't think she's going to get away with everything, because her Lord is involved in that, Venus in the 8th with Mars, the 7th and 12th Lord, the eclipse triggering her 7th house. The previous lunar eclipse triggered her 1st house. I don't think that she can get away with that with Venus, Mars and Venus in her 8th house right now. And there has to be some form of punishment, surely. But anyway, I think that's, just wanted to use that as an example to say that you have to have something triggering it. And then the cycle, and then she's in Mars cycle, which is the planet that's triggering the eclipse in her 7th house, right? So this is like, the 12th house is very much about hidden as well, and it's bringing it up again in her 7th house. So we're going to hear all about her relations for the next few weeks. But you might not have any planets in Taurus, Scorpio. You might be in a Jupiter cycle, and it just might not be impacting you the same way. It still is impacting you in terms of Taurus and Scorpio, whatever areas of your life these represent, but it just might not be that intense. So this is a good thing to think of in terms of the serpents or Nagas in this case. Now, Nagas refer to Ketu more so, and they're a higher vibration, if you will, of the serpents, the serpent deities, and Sarpas are a lower vibration, you might say, related to Rahu. But this is Sadhguru, and he mentions Naga here, but let's think of this maybe as Sarpa. He's talking specifically about this Naga dosha. This is a combination in the chart. It's different to Kala Sarpa dosha or Kala Sarpa yoga. So Naga always has to be backed up by something. So remember, the eclipses, they're shadows, they're not physical entities. It is not an energy of itself, it's a perception. It is receptive. So it's all about perceptions, basically. So the most basic Naga dosha is being identified with your reptilian brain. It's not an ailment. Ignorance is not an ailment. I'm just quoting him from actually what he was speaking. So that's why I just transcribed it. But it's the worst thing. The worst kind of evil on the planet is ignorance. And so again, in terms of Ketu and Mars coming together now, the best of Naga is this heightened awareness and pure beingness, we'll put it that way, and clarity and perception. And the worst is the Sarpas, the lower form, and this lack of clarity and perception and distortion and complete and utter delusion, let's face it. That's the worst of it. And this, again, reptilian brain would represent this kind of fight or flight. You don't make any good decisions because you're in fear mode, and it doesn't matter what you do because it's just not going to work out because you're just full of fear. So again, when I highlight that story about how they're reporting on this current, variant, it's of course understandable then that governments get into panic mode and then lock down their country. And it's also in a way because of how it began and how they didn't do that. So now they're trying to make up for lost time and say, okay, now we're going to do this one right. But the problem, there's many other problems on the foot of that. So anyway, won't keep going on about that issue. Let's go to the full moon then on the 19th. So opposite then the sun, as the sun moves into Sagittarius on the 16th, and we have sun in Sagittarius from the 16th of December. And in this root sign, this Mula, and then opposite we have the full moon in Mrigashirsha, and this is in Gemini on the 19th. And this is, an interesting dynamic because you have the sun, of course, in the root sign and all about getting to the root of something, getting to the root cause. And I think in the coming weeks, we will find out about the origins, and not maybe even so importantly about the origins of the virus, but actually the kind of root cause, or how do we get to the root of this, the bottom of this, and deal with it. So we're going to get to that a lot over the next few weeks. But this particular full moon balances out these the need of Sagittarius to get to the root of something, to the truth, and to express an opinion, which is what Gemini is all about. Now, the issue with this full moon, and full moons in general, is that they're very outward. It's like seeking something outward. It's very social. And this one in this very curious sign, the deer head, and its symbol of the antlers being this kind of symbolic representation of how the mind can go off in all different directions. That's what it symbolizes. So it's like, yourself, full moons are intense. Okay, I'm using the word intense again. But when you allow your mind to just drift in any kind of which way it will, without any kind of reining it in, it can really go down some really interesting paths. And that's an issue when we get to the next one, because the one after this, after Mrigashirsha, is Ardra. So that's why when you let the mind roam freely and innocently, it doesn't end well usually. And we have to we back ourselves into a corner and we kind of get stuck, and then we have to realize we have to come out again. So this is going to be an interesting full moon for that reason. This is the full moon itself. You can see here, it's at 3 degrees 20 Gemini, sun here at 3:20 Sagittarius, and you can see Mars and Ketu are very close still. This is on the 19th, so it's just a few days after. So it's still intense, and Mars is aspecting here as well as Rahu. So in a way, there is a lot of intensity about this full moon, even though it's not an eclipse, and all of that. But anyway, that's the full moon. The last thing I want to talk about, so there's so much going on in December, it's unreal. But anyway, the last thing I want to talk about is Venus retrograde. So Venus retrogrades from December 19th. It's just peaked into Capricorn, and it's conjunct Pluto. And it will retrograde back into Sagittarius by the end of December 30th. And then we'll continue to retrograde until January 29th. So really, the last part of December, all of January, we're going into this review mode in terms of Venus type issues. Now, depending on what it is in your chart, of course, you'll be reviewing that area of your life. But in general, we could say that everybody will be reviewing finances, relationships. And because this is happening over the Christmas, and on Christmas Day, Venus and Pluto, Venus retrograde and Pluto are conjunct on Christmas Day. It means that we're all going to be, well, how will I put this? We're all going to be so intensely focusing on what we value because maybe we can't have what we value, or because something of value is taken away, or because we test others' values or loyalties, or our loyalties are tested, or whatever power play we get involved with, in other words, with Venus, Pluto, especially around a dinner table at Christmas. I mean, you could imagine the kind of things that this would lead to, all kinds of different opinions, and everyone has their own whatever. But the interesting thing with family dynamics, of course, is that family are the people who've instilled values in you. So you can imagine Pluto and Venus coming together, kind of challenging those maybe. Now, I could imagine around the world, dinner table after dinner table after dinner table, coming together, who haven't seen each other for a long time, discussing all of the very many things and the problems of the world. And you could imagine that this could really go south quickly. So just be mindful, I would say, around Christmas time, especially because Venus retrograde is about being very mindful of our relationships in general, that we might have to slow down and pay attention to more other people's feelings, as well as our own hurt feelings, or feelings of neglect or lack of appreciation on our part or their part, whatever it is going on. So there's a process here. So this image, of course, of the last temptation of Christ ties in with Venus retrograde because of the 40 days and 40 nights that Venus is retrograde, going out into the desert, denying himself the kind of very basic pleasures of life, which are Venus, and then being tempted by the devil. And that's basically Venus retrograde and conjunct Pluto. If there were ever a Venus retrograde conjunct Pluto like story, this is it. And of course, it's every Venus retrograde, this last temptation of Christ. But in particular, when Venus actually finishes, or when it's past the sun, and actually, by the way, Venus can only be combust, it's said, while it's retrograde. So that's something to be mindful of because of its unusual spin. It goes in the opposite direction of all the other planets. So when it meets with the sun, and after that, towards the end of this cycle in January, that is probably the most important time to be very mindful of being tempted. Now, whatever that means for you. So again, you have to relate it to what Venus rules in your chart, but whatever it rules, there'll be this sense of being tested in maybe some way, or something maybe not, maybe kind of some power struggle, in other words, or just being intrigued by something that's dark, quote unquote, in quality or in nature. And then you're kind of wanting to go there and experience that, and you don't know why, but there's this need to experience that. And it's this kind of, again, this temptation that's thrown in your way, perhaps. So again, just be mindful of overdoing that tendency. Don't burn any bridges. Think about, Venus being about tact and decorum and good manners, and that you don't act out in ways that might affect other people, which, it's just adding to their load as well, because everybody's going through this in their own way, and everybody's working out their own set of values. So the most obvious expression, of course, is that families maybe who can't be together because of lockdowns, people who can't. Now, I guess the very simple thing is that people who don't get what they want for Christmas, I don't know, like physical things. And, you think again of this story of Jesus Christ and him denying himself the very basics in life. Why would you do that? Because basically it's teaching us, I'm sounding all really religious now, but anyway, it's teaching us when we take away the kind of basic needs, or just luxuries, and we just have basics, it's teaching us about more intangible values, basically. And this transit will certainly teach us about intangible values. So anyway, before I wrap it up and then take questions, I'm not going to have time to go through the month day by day. I might just highlight a couple of those key dates that I showed you in the chart. But I just want to remind you that the magazine launch is on the 12th of December at 7 p.m. Universal Time, GMT. This time of year, of course, it's the same, GMT, Universal Time, the same. So 7 p.m. on the 12th of December. It's a Sunday, I believe. I hope it is. Yes, it's a Sunday. So I just got the magazine back from the proofreader. So tomorrow I'm finishing that, and then we'll be sending it off to print. So if anyone is on the higher tier, $10 or up, you'll get a physical copy by the end of the month, hopefully. I don't know if I can really rely on the post. Postal service is really slow these days, so we'll see. But hopefully by the end of the year, if not into New Year. And then for everybody, you'll obviously get access from the 12th of December as a patron. It won't be released to the public until the New Year. So you'll be able to read it online anyway. All patrons can read it online from the 12th. And I'll have just kind of like a launch kind of due on the 12th. So please join me for that. Let me just, questions. I did have one question already from Penny, who asked me this. So Penny asked, should we avoid traveling around December 14th, or are there activities you should be avoiding? Penny obviously has seen that Mars and Ketu are coming together on the 14th. So she's asked that question very purposely, maybe to help other people understand what's going on as well. And I mentioned it already, that again, as long as you are mindful and centered and in whatever action you're taking, I think there's no harm in doing anything. However, there's a big but here. You can be as mindful as you want to be, and you might not have anything going on in your chart and suggesting that this could be a potential, reactive time for you. And you're very centered and you've meditated that morning and you go off and you do your business and blah, blah, blah. But then you're meeting all of these people on the way, and you can so easily get sucked into their drama. And so what I would say is maybe it's best to be step back a bit more around the mid-month period, especially because other people are going to be reacting very strongly to this. So to answer your question, you can you can certainly travel, but let's face it, when you're traveling, you're cooped up with people in a very small cabin, and people are reactive around this kind of conjunction. So maybe not. Travel if you can avoid it. If you do have to travel though, or you want to travel, again, just be very mindful and centered. And then when you see people reacting strongly, just step aside. Just don't get involved in it. That's what I'd say. Or if you see yourself reacting very strongly, try and be centered enough so that you can step aside from your reactions. So that's what I'd say about that. Let me just share, I don't know if I have time actually now to share, maybe a couple of things on the chart. Make sure that you can see that. I hope you can see that. So this is the this is 28th where we are now. I'm going to bring it forward just to some key dates I mentioned there. So this is the 28th. I'm recording this, 29th. We can see here the moon is waning now into the sun. And by the 1st, it's joined Mars. 2nd, it's with Mars. And then on the 4th, this is the eclipse. And you can see here that Mars has basically moved in later on the 4th or into the 5th, depending on where you are in the world. So this then is this kind of Kalasarpa yoga. All of the planets now are on one side. It's easier to maybe see on this chart, but all the planets are all on one side of the nodes and creating this kind of very lopsided experience and this kind of, imbalanced experience really for the next few months. The moon breaks it every couple of weeks, but every couple of weeks we still have this until the 24th of April. So it's this sense of, again, just maybe our perceptions being a bit skewed, I would say, at the very least. So then that's the 5th. And I'll just show you the one other thing I want to say though as well, and I didn't mention in those slides, is that the moon joins Jupiter here on the 9th and 10th. Now, Jupiter has started to settle into Aquarius, but it doesn't move into the next lunar mansion, Shatabishak, or Shatabishaj, some people pronounce. until the new year. So actually, I think it is the 1st of January. The 1st of January that Jupiter moves into this 100 healers sign in Aquarius. Now that obviously points to developments in more treatments in the new year. But still, it's in Aquarius, so it is still better. And the good news about that as well is for those who have Libra prominent, is that Jupiter and Saturn both aspect now. Up until now, it was just this kind of heavy sort of Saturn with Jupiter not really giving any kind of influence. Now it's giving a strong influence to Libra. So Libra is getting a better time of it now. Cancer, unfortunately, still is getting the kind of rub of it because it's got Saturn and Pluto aspecting. And you know what? It's like, I was thinking of it just today. Cancer is like, they're the carers, they're the doctors. They're getting, one of the worst rubs of it, So the moon then moves on 14, 15. I'm just going to bring it to the full moon. Don't have time really to go through day by day. So this is the full moon on the 19th, opposite in Gemini. It'll actually be 3 degrees, so it'll be in the beginning of Gemini. But actually, as it moves into Gemini, then I think this is quite explosive itself, because once it moves into Ardra, in the divisional chart, it moves from Scorpio to Sagittarius. So it's kind of like hovering around here during that day. So the full moon is quite full on as well. Don't think that it's not just because it's in this nice Gemini sign. I think there's something quite intense about this itself. And the fact that, it's breaking this yoga, but still there's now the other side of that, of course, Ardra as well, after the full moon, is that it's also about overcoming something, just as this eclipse is all about overcoming something. There's so much to go through in this month. I just, I knew this was going to be a struggle to get it all in. But anyway, I'm going to skip through the rest of the month. I'm not sure if I want to say any more about, oh yeah, I did want to say about the end of the month. Here is Mars on 18 degrees on the 30th of December. This is a trigger for the eclipse. So remember, the eclipse day itself doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to happen. So don't necessarily expect anything to happen. But when planets, especially malefics, or the term malefics, Mars and Saturn, transit the eclipse degree, then it can be quite a malefic event. Even if benefics transit the eclipse degree, I mean, it still highlights something, it brings something out. It might not be a malefic event, but it's like, it's maybe surprising. It's revealing. Eclipses always reveal something, but Mars is particularly revealing. It, like I said, it externalizes things, so it pushes it out into our awareness. So this could be a good thing, because there might be something that you're unaware of in your own life in the area of Scorpio that you're going to have revealed to you. But in general, again, around the world, this could be something revealed around the virus, of course, is the most obvious expression. But many other things too, many other kind of revelations that I think a lot of people would prefer remain hidden. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that. That's the 31st, then how it finishes out the month. You can see here Venus has moved back into Sagittarius on the 30th, after hanging out with Pluto for a lot of December, most of December, really. Or the end of December, more so. And then stationing on the 19th, again, and retrograde and right on Pluto. So, oh, and by the way, the other thing I meant to mention as well, if I could just pull it back just a couple of days, you can see here, Venus, Mercury, Pluto all together, while Mars and Ketu come together. So if there were ever a Scorpio month, this is it. Basically, it's all Scorpio themes. It's all about revealing the hidden. It's all about overcoming our fears. It's all about getting over something. Dig deep, find the courage within yourself to get over whatever it is that you need to get over in your life, because there's a lot of energy to do that in December. So I hope that's helpful to everyone listening on the playback. If anyone has any questions that are here, please feel free. We have another 10 minutes, so I'm happy to take any questions. And for everyone else, thanks for tuning in, and until next time.